I'm Naeema Raza. Welcome to Open to Debate. January is a month that is often cold and often one that is dry. And by that, I don't mean the climate. Every new year, many people make a resolution to stop drinking, some with the goal of a month and others with the goal of forever. So it seemed timely to examine the leading movement in this space, Alcoholics Anonymous, and debate the question, does AA work? There are over 120,000 AA groups worldwide. 50% of them are in the United States, and the organization's worldwide membership is estimated at around 2 million people. So it's no surprise that AA is often credited and lauded for its role in recovery. Yet the organization also gets its fair share of criticism, with complaints around AA's religious roots, its effectiveness, and even its dominance over other potential alternatives. So does AA work? To answer that, let me introduce our debaters. Arguing yes that AA does work is Dan Griffin. He has a master's in sociology with 3 decades of experience as a speaker and expert on recovery in AA, and he's notably the author of A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps. Dan, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And here to argue no to the question, does AA work, we have Adi Jaffe. Adi holds a PhD in psychology, and he's the founder of Ignited, as well as the author of the forthcoming book, Unhooked, Freeing Yourself from Addiction Forever, available this January. Adi, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you both for being here today and for debating this. I really want to get to what brought you here, but first, let's hear your opening statements. We want each of you to take a few minutes to explain your position and set the table here. So Dan, you're up first. You're arguing that yes, AA does work. Tell us why.
All right. Well, it's a true pleasure to be here having this conversation with Dr. Jaffe. And let me be very clear. I do not represent AA or speak for AA. I'm a friend of AA. The fundamental question appears to be, does AA work? And so first, AA has one primary purpose, and that's to help the alcoholic who is still suffering. It's done that as best it can for 90 years. And so it really doesn't have an opinion on this issue. The next point is, what are we referring to when we say AA? There's the AA organization, there's the AA program of recovery that people participate in, and then there are the meetings that, as you said, all over the world where people practice the program according to a group conscience that can differ from one country to the next and even from one state to the next. Is AA the only effective program for alcoholism? Absolutely not. And AA has never purported to be that. It states clearly in its literature numerous times that it is not. Is AA for everybody? Absolutely not. Because those who are not alcoholic, though to be clear, what AA says about membership in the program is that it's really for those who have a desire to stop drinking. And that's the only requirement. People with addictive disorders do not come into AA usually ready for help. A lot of the times they've come after being forced. And certainly a lot of the time after having tried to control and moderate their drinking, because the truth is the last place that a lot of people want to end up is AA. There's also been a lot of significant research asking the same question as to whether or not AA works. And some of the research has said no, and some of the research has said yes. The most recent research that I could find was a comprehensive meta-analytical study by Kelly, Humphreys, and Ferry. It looked at 27 studies with over 10,000 participants, and it found unequivocally that compared to individual therapeutic interventions, like 4 it looked at, that AA was unequivocally more effective than individual therapy alone. The good news is, it doesn't have to be just AA by itself. There's also extensive research showing the power of connection in healing far beyond addiction, right? Numerous illnesses and other social issues have adopted the 12-step approach, not including the fact that there are dozens of different types of 12-step programs, all of which are trying to address and heal this massive epidemic of disconnection and loneliness that's plaguing our country and our world. So is it perfect? Of course not. Dr. Jaffe, who I know is an ally in a much larger cause of helping those suffering, is likely to tell you that AA is behind the times, or it's antiquated, and it's served its purpose. There's some truth to that. But it is changing as driven by the members of AA itself. whether it's effective mental health treatment and the use of medication paired with AA involvement, understanding the impact of trauma, or being more open to looking at sexist or gender biased language, and being a safe place for all sexual and gender identities. All of that is happening in AA, though it's not being driven by the organization itself, but the membership. So AA works. It works imperfectly, no doubt, but in its almost 90 years, next year is 90 years, it has transformed the lives of millions of people and has had an indelible and positive impact on our society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Adi, you disagree. You are arguing that AA does not work. You have 4 minutes to make your case.
Thank you. And thank you, Dan, for starting us off. Very, very excited to be part of this debate. And, as we were preparing for this debate, there were some slight, maybe more substantial changes in the focus that we were looking to have. It started off with, is AA the best treatment there is? Dan spoke about that a good bit. Does AA deliver on its promises? Which, if you're not really familiar with AA, you may not even know what the promises are. And then, does AA work? Which is where we landed in the end. And so for myself, as I was collecting evidence and trying to figure out what I was going to talk about, I had to understand my primary question. And the primary question that I was asking as I was preparing for this was, can you rely on AA to provide positive results for people with addiction if you refer them to the organization, the system, the meetings, as Dan talked about? It's even nebulous what exactly you mean by AA. And so in this debate, I had to come up with a working definition. And to me, working means that treatment, that approach will provide reliable and effective resolution of the problem while causing no additional harm. And what I'm going to present here today is that by that definition, AA does not work as a treatment for addiction. First of all, as Dan already pointed out, it is only meant for a very small subset of people looking to stop drinking forever, which immediately rules out, at least by some measures, at least half, if not more than half, of people who struggle with drinking. So it's not even meant for at least half of the people, if not more. It also has very low long-term success rates, even among the people who do choose it and say that they want to stop forever, right? We're talking 5, 6, 7, 8% success rate long-term. It is not reliably applied. Dan already talked about it, right? Every meeting is different. It's not even controlled by the primary organization. So the treatment is even different depending on which room you walk into all over the world. And that's because its process lacks scientific rigor and validation. And then a really, really other important fact, engagement in it can cause psychological harm through shame and stigma and use of language. Maybe it's changing right now, but historically, complete resistance to evidence-based other practices like meditation, medication, and trauma approaches. Literally some people being kicked out or not allowed into meetings because they are not sober, taking what is considered by the entire medical community a medically recognized treatment. So if a treatment can't consistently produce positive outcomes and then also produce some harm, I can't consider it to be working. Now, Dan pointed this out, and I want to speak to it. There's no doubt that there are many people, some of them great friends of mine, who say that they were helped by AA and who avidly talk about the wonders of AA and how it worked for them. But here, I think it's important to really understand that anecdotal evidence, no matter from how many people, doesn't create an effective treatment. And we've had this happen a number of times, many, many times before in the medical and mental health community. Bloodletting in Greece was considered an evidence-based practice that works for hundreds, if not thousands of people, where people had blood let out of them for humors to be able to escape, to prevent mental illness. That's been heavily debunked, right? Like bloodletting, AA is based on really outdated model. And it's great that it's been around for 90 years, but we've learned a lot in 90 years. Even medical approaches, lobotomies, for instance, were massively popular in the 30s and 50s, specifically, let's say, for schizophrenia. This was the practice of putting in blunt instruments, and literally disrupting prefrontal cortical parts of the brain. By the 1960s, this was completely debunked and showing that it caused severe cognitive and emotional damage. People won Nobel Prizes and were recognized and lauded for how great of a treatment it was at the time. Just because something looks really, really good at one point in time doesn't mean it's actually effective. And maybe much more relevant to our discussion here, and to Dan's point, insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive shock therapy were other approaches that had been adjusted over time, but they needed rigorous scientific study to know what to adjust, because the way they were being used originally in treatment were really, really harmful. And so by all of those measures, what I want to say is this. AA was potentially the best option that we had 100 years ago. I'm not going to argue against that. That's great. But we have come a long way. When we put it to the test again, everything we know right now, it's clear that AA as a whole doesn't work, and it would need some substantial updating to be considered a best-in-class approach.
Thank you both for those opening arguments. I just want to ask you the question of what motivated you to come here and talk about this topic today. Adi, maybe go first and take a minute. Tell us why you're here.
Sure. I used to struggle with addiction. I had it started at the age of 14, but by the time I was 25, 26, I had been heavily addicted to meth for, 6 or 7 years at that point. I was 124 pounds, which is about 40, 45 pounds lighter than I am right now. I'm standing in front of you. I'd gotten involved in heavy drug dealing, and meth was one of the drugs I used, but I used everything. I'd just been completely disconnected from my family, and I ended up going through a SWAT team arrest. You mentioned the upcoming book. That's how I opened the book. 12 officers knocking down my door, 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. And I've spent the last 15, 16 years of my life. It's been 22 years since that. I had to go to jail. I had to go to rehab. I did a lot of things myself to get through that problem. And when I was done with all that, I had to figure out, first of all, what the heck happened to me? And then secondly, once I got heavily involved in the research, I really made it my mission to go help so many other people. There are millions and millions. SAMHSA just updated the number, over 40 million people who struggle. I've made it my point, as Dan pointed out, and I know it's his as well, to help as many people out there as possible.
Thank you for sharing that, Adi. It sounds like you've had quite a journey to where you are now.
Yep.
Did you, by the way, experiment with AA as well in your process?
You can call it experiment. It was the only option that was presented to me. So every rehab I went to, everywhere I went to, I was sent to AA. Absolutely. I was in AA for 3 years.
Got it. Thanks very much. All right, Dan, I know you mentioned you're not a spokesperson, you're not representing AA, but you are a friend of the organization. What brought you here today?
Sure. So congrats on your sobriety, however you're doing it. I have deep respect for AA despite its imperfections, which I fully acknowledge. But I've worked in addictions and mental health for over 30 years, and I've seen the tragedy and insanity of addiction up close. I've buried far too many people to count. And I know that AA has saved the lives of many people I've known and made a difference in countless families. Perhaps most importantly, my father was a chronic alcoholic who went to AA. He tried desperately to control and moderate his drinking until it literally killed him. I do not see that as AA's failure. I see it as evidence of the brutality of this disease, frankly. It was the people of AA's response to him and my family when he died that helped me see actually how special of an organization it is.
Thank you very much, Dan, for sharing that as well. So before we dive into the debate in true form, I want to try and summarize your opening arguments briefly, because you seem to agree on a few things, actually. You agreed that AA is not a monolith, that there are tons of variations in terms of how these meetings are run geographically, how the organization and programming is run. You also agreed that AA is not for everyone, that sobriety is not the solution for everyone. It's not going to be the solution for everyone. And you both agree that AA is imperfect, but you disagree on whether or not AA fundamentally works. And Dan, you're arguing that yes, it does work. And to point to that, you point to the data, the millions of people who have been helped by Alcoholics Anonymous, as well as recent research looking at the outcomes and showing that the outcomes from AA are beneficial. And while they can be complemented by other therapies, but they are indeed beneficial according to the research you're citing. And you also, I think, made a really important point about community, that a core function of Alcoholics Anonymous is this community and the bonding and the support structure that allows, and also the accountability structure that allows, I think. Adi, you see things differently. It seems like fundamentally you think that while AA is popular, it's not always correct. And you cited a bunch of historical examples, from bloodletting to lobotomy to other examples, metaphors that I'm not sure AA would look kindly upon, to say, hey, what works right now, what's popular, and what's the modality of treatment right now actually might be phased out over time, or it might be the wrong one. And so you think sobriety as a goal, it seems, is not necessarily the best goal. It's certainly, as you cited, not the goal for everyone, and the data reflects that. And you went out to say that it doesn't provide consistent outcomes, and it also can provide harm, can actually create harm for people going through AA, whether that engagement creates more shame, whether that standard of sobriety is too high, and other means. So I think they fundamentally stated your two perspectives. Is that fair, gentlemen?
That was a nice summary.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
that was great.
So I want to get to this first question of the goal, because so much of AA is designed around abstinence and this commitment to abstinence. So Dan, tell me why total and lifelong sobriety, this kind of the extreme form of abstinence, is the right goal, in your opinion, for this organization to have. Because Adi has two critiques here. It's one, too high for a hurdle for entry, and two, too high a hurdle for success, maybe.
So I'll approach that a couple ways. I mean, one, I would say there's nowhere in the literature where you're going to hear somebody say in AA that you have to stop drinking forever. There are, the idea is implanted for people that to continue drinking could lead to incredible loss of your life or impact on your life. But really, like I said, the requirement is a desire to stop drinking, not stop drinking forever. In fact, that's where the popular saying "one day at a time" comes from. It also implies that if you're not abstaining from alcohol, you're not welcome, which is definitely not the case, because AA really doesn't turn anybody away. In fact, if you talk to people in AA, they'll tell you stories of how people come under the influence to a meeting, and then they take them by the hand, and maybe a few members will talk to them by themselves. So the goal, quite frankly, is for people to find a relationship to alcohol that works best for them. And there is never a statement in AA that says, if you want to continue drinking, you're not welcome here. It's just, how is that working for you and how is that helping you? I don't think people are shamed so much as they are challenged to really look honestly at the continued impact of how it's affecting them. And for some people, they'll say, you know what? This isn't really for me. And AA will say, hey, okay, we wish you well. That literally is some language in the literature. If you can continue to drink and drink socially, our hats are off to you. That's one of the quotes.
So that certainly sounds kind of more peaceful than, Adi, the kind of harm that you were laying out, this harm argument you were making, that AA, not just does it not provide consistent results, it also can create some harm. There is a quote from Keith Humphreys, a PhD and psychologist at Stanford, who conducted a high-level kind of meta-study on AA's effectiveness, saying that AA absolutely does work, that people who are in these groups have 20 to 60% better abstinence than people in other treatments. In no case did they come out worse. I'm curious what you make of this finding. I can imagine maybe what you think of the abstinence part, but really responding to the "in no case did they come out worse" argument.
Yeah. So look, I'll give you another researcher, Robert Ashford, if you want to look up more academic analysis, who specifically has created an entire body of research talking about how people come out worse. By the way, one of the Keith Humphreys co-authors, John Kelly, has also said himself that using stigmatizing language, to which alcoholic, addict, etc., terms that are part and parcel to AA, create stigma and harm and keep people out of getting help. So while Keith's point is great by what he's looking at, I'll just go to the research that he examined, right? So Dan quoted this specific study. This is a recent meta-analysis that was completed. I'm literally looking at the data in front of me right now as we're saying it. The only measure that was seen to be substantial, like high certainty of evidence that AA was better, was in continuous or long-term sobriety, which makes sense because it is the system that espouses long-term sobriety. So the people who decide to participate and stay long-term in AA have bought into that. But here's what we have to understand. There's a difference between saying, yeah, sure, for the 7 to 10% of people who stay with us long term, we find success, versus the 70% who typically leave within 3 months and the upwards of 90% who fail within a year. So look, if
But you don't know
this
how many
debate,
of those people return. and that's not something that's actually tracked.
Well, we
But
can't
people
track
within
it because it's
AA,
anonymous.
I know,
We don't get.
but within AA, people have a sense of people who leave and come back and leave and come back as
Yeah,
they're
but that's
trying to figure these things
I
out.
know, but
And that's
Dan, a
something you have to
sense,
take into consideration. The other
but a
thing is
sense is
about the
not going to
research,
make academic evidence. We can't argue
about
that
the
a sense
research.
is evidence.
The research you cited, the abstinence is the one that's unequivocal, right? But it also goes on to say, it showed to be equal to or slightly better in other
Potentially,
areas as well.
potentially,
Some
may
potentially, some
perform as
others.
well.
Yes,
May
yes.
perform as well. Now
But you didn't
here's
mention
so
that
again,
part.
well, I answered the question that she asked, which was, but what you said that is unequivocally showed that it was better. They had like 12 analyses, and one of them showed unequivocal evidence. All of it, the rest of it was may, perhaps, could, potentially. I would argue that's not unequivocal
That's the
evidence. Number
author's
one.
language, unequivocal.
But here's the thing. I think that the argument Adi is making is that the litmus test for success is the mission of the organization, and therefore the organization, corroborates that success, and that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in some way. I do wonder,
Called
though, Adi,
self-selection.
that's your argument. But Adi, what if sobriety isn't the goal? What should be the goal? And can there
So actually,
be? Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is a beautiful point because, and I said this in my opening argument, I think that if AA did as an organization what Dan said at the end of his argument, and that is if they refreshed the thinking to catch up with the world, which by the way they haven't been willing to touch. If you read some of the literature, I mean it's almost offensive to read. If they updated it, I would
They
agree
did.
that AA would catch up. But I wrote a first book before Unhooked called The Abstinence Myth. AA can certainly help people cut down. But now, again, just like Dan pointed out, anecdotal evidence, I've sat in many, many, many AA meetings, and I've seen many, many people who relapse chronically with before 30 days and just couldn't get their 30-day chipped and were shunned in meetings. So the point for me is more this. If AA could relax a little bit and say, look, we understand that the bar of abstinence is a high one. If you're here to address your drinking, we welcome you in. If the language organizationally widened, and then if one of the outcomes that they were willing to measure is improvement, I would be a much, much bigger supporter
But
of
I'm
AA.
I'm guessing you're not familiar with the plain language big book that's just come out, Adi.
The
Because
plain language.
it's precisely what you're talking about, and it's got a lot of people in AA very, very excited, and professionals very excited, because it's the very first time in those 90 years that they have rewritten the big book with language intentionally done so that it's more accessible and more welcoming than the 1930s language.
Right. I see Adi is now scrambling at Google, looking at the big book. But I think that this, kind of core, as I'm listening to this debate, there's this kind of core question of, is the point of treatment to treat the symptom or the underlying cause? I think part of, Adi, if I'm understanding your argument, is that, and it reminds me of some other research, and I want to make sure our listeners and viewers on YouTube are not lost in the research, but we're citing some specific ones that are influential and important in the
Sure.
debate. So someone who takes the opposite position of Keith Humphreys, the researcher that I noted before, is Lance Dodds, MD, a psychiatrist and researcher who's been critical of AA as a champion of the theory that addictions are psychological compulsions. And he says AA may serve as an adjunctive support for the 5 to 8% of people who do well with it, a point that Adi is making as well. But it is not a treatment for the psychological cause of the problem and should never be presented as the best or only option. Now, I know, Dan, you're not arguing that this is the best nor the only option. You're very clear in your opening argument about that. But I do want you to respond to this idea of, is AA treating a symptom? Is it trying to provide a measurable solution that's like a one size fits all in terms of sobriety, versus having the nuance and infrastructure to really get to underlying causes?
So I'm going to answer that in a couple of ways.
Okay.
First, we've learned a lot in 90 years. I mean, we could argue that there wouldn't be the current addiction field if there hadn't been AA. And there's been an evolution And within that addiction field, there's been advances in understanding of the intricacies of the interrelationship of mental health and trauma and shame and addiction in major significant ways. And that has come into the treatment complex and the treatment world. And then it's been coming into AA as well as those people are coming into the meetings. So that's one thing, is that there is that evolution of awareness that's happening. Two, AA has never said the AA program is solely meetings and working the steps. There's language in the big book that says we encourage you to work with professionals who can help you in other ways. Lots of opportunities available. There's pamphlets that talk about that. And so that's another thing. Then the other is that I think even the program of AA itself and the program of recovery through the 12 steps and what they call working the steps, that is a process that gets to a lot of the underlying things. And while a lot of people don't necessarily understand it, I would say, in fact, it's been reviewed itself compared to like CBT, MET, other things like that, other kind of therapeutic interventions, and 12-step facilitation uses the 12 steps. And in Project Match, as well as in some of the studies from the one we've just been talking about with Humphreys and Kelly, 12-step facilitation has been shown to be as effective, if not more effective, and in addressing those issues.
I see Adi kind of clamoring to get in when you said that it starts to address some of the underlying causes. So Adi, what's going on?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, 12-step facilitation is a manualized approach. And part of my entire problem with AA is every meeting is an entirely different universe, which makes it, imagine for a second if when somebody prescribed you an antidepressant, one pill was completely different than another. Would we be able to say that antidepressant is effective? We wouldn't, because you literally wouldn't know what you're taking. So the way AA is delivered is not controlled, which is a horrible, horrible way to then provide care. It's different literally from one room to another room. Now, 12-step facilitation seeks to eliminate some of that. Now, here's what I'm willing to say, right? If you land on somebody who is mental health aware and understands trauma and understands other approaches and is open to those, and they walk you through a manualized way of doing any care, but sure, also 12-step facilitation, then you may get to underlying issues. But that is not what AA does.
It's not as freewheeling, though, as you're presenting it, because there really is a guidance in AA meetings that's a thread that runs throughout. I mean, and that is the structure of meetings. Maybe that's not always the exact same, but there's some very similar structure. But certainly the core thread of the literature and the 12 steps, that is something that consistently, wherever you go, I guarantee you're going to find it. And so that doesn't exist.
I can tell you you're wrong. I can tell you you're wrong by not anecdotal evidence, by walking into rooms where those were not followed. Where in small towns all over America, when you walk into a meeting, they may choose to have their own traditions. There is no control by the general organization. There is zero control by the general organization.
Okay, there's no control. I grant you that, because of the individual group conscience, which is actually something that's very fascinating. I mean, people have studied, I'll just share this as a little bit of an aside. People have actually studied the organizational principles that guide AA through the 12 traditions and the 12 concepts and all the writings that have been done. And several sociologists have concluded that it's the closest thing to democracy that's ever been established in our societies. BOOF is one of them, BUFE.
Adi, I want to take a moment, democracy aside, I want to take a moment to think, well, what is a better alternative to AA? You're coming here, you're saying this is imperfect. It's, you're pointing out the kind of challenges of having some structure, but not total structure, the lack of an ability to have nuance, and the kind of, the audience for whom AA works. But what is there out there that you think people should be seeking out instead?
I love it. So first of all, my main argument around addiction is that, completely contrary to the thing the notion that is repeated over and over in AA. People who struggle with addiction are not the same. I want to avoid using the term that they use over and over and over because it's been shown to be stigmatizing. People who struggle with alcohol are not the same. It's this ridiculous notion that we have that because people drink compulsively, they are all the same kind of a person. It literally says that in the book, right? That they're all alcoholics. Now, my point is, some of them have biological dysfunction. Some of them have mental health issues. Some of them have trauma and PTSD. The different approaches actually need to customize and be specifically directed to the individual struggle. This idea that you can have 12 steps that are written on a piece of paper and they would blanket apply. And I want to make another really, really important point because Dan made a correct point, which is the assertion in the AA literature is that it is not the only treatment. But the de facto reality in our industry in this country is that it has become the de facto treatment. And there's a very simple reason. Groups are free. And as somebody who works in the industry, I can tell you that, of course, as a treatment center, it's nice to send your people to 2 to 3 free meetings every single day. But unfortunately, not everybody has a good fit. And Dan, I will give you this, that is not the point of AA. But you already said that AA is this nebulous architecture. What ends up happening is people who shouldn't be going end up going. People for whom it's not effective, they end up essentially being forced to go to these meetings.
But where should they go instead, Adi, especially if they can't afford it? I mean, this is a free option that's providing an element of care that may be imperfect. It may be, blunt force that kind of, hammer to every single situation. But at the cost point that this is being offered
So first of all, that's the responsibility of our healthcare system. And number two, I mean, look, if bloodletting was free, is anybody on this call right now running to get some free bloodletting because it's free? No,
gotta go,
and I understand
gotta go,
that.
Guys, just kidding.
I got some on my back right now.
I know. I understand it's an extreme point, but the point that I'm making is you're making a great point. Smart recovery is a good one. There's Dharma recovery, right? There are a lot of new approaches in the last 10 to 15 years.
Perfect. And then I want, Dan, you to respond to this question. And I'm not asking these questions from a point of view on this debate. I'm simply asking to get a comprehensive understanding of the situation and see where you guys disagree and agree. But Dan, Adi is fundamentally making this argument that dominance is a problem, that like it's a bit of an economic argument, actually, that the size and scale of AA, that it's ease and it's like low cost of entry into new markets because it's this free resource that, recovery experts are able to send people to free meetings, that it's crowding out entry, that it's stumping innovation, that it's, it's kind of crippling the ability to respond and treat this problem that you care so much about. Respond to that.
Let's be really clear, okay? AA isn't doing any of this. The treatment industry is doing this. And treatment is not AA. They are completely 100% separate, although they have gotten entangled in many ways. AA does not ally with any treatment center. It does not endorse any treatment center. It has supported a long time ago. Well, I don't even think it didn't even support it in that way, but AA members supported the development and continue to support the development. And because a lot of treatment is driven by people who are in recovery in AA, that kind of mentality is there sometimes. I've actually seen the opposite of what Adi's talking about. Again, I've worked in the field for 30 years. I remember when people didn't have options offered to them. They could go to an AA meeting and that was it. Now it's like all kinds of options that they're being offered, including not meetings. You could go to church if you want to go to church. The idea is to emphasize the importance of the support after treatment, some kind of ongoing support, because, like if you believe that addiction is a chronic illness, as many people do, and you look at the science and the research behind chronic illnesses and how to treat them most effectively, then you understand that engagement in services of some kind of support for like 3 to 5 years is kind of optimal. For addiction, it seems to be even more so. So the idea that people are only sending people in treatment to AA meetings is because it's free, I think that's really a misstatement.
I'm not saying it's free, but I'm asking you to
he
respond
did.
to this.
Adi
Yeah, fine.
did. He said the only reason they send it to him is because it's free.
Oh,
And
you
I
said,
would
yeah,
say,
I didn't say the
yes.
only reason.
But
But
a
I
key
you
said
reason,
said,
I
a
think
big
found.
reason.
you emphasized
Yeah.
the fact that it was free and implied that that's why
Right.
they send
But-
them. And I would say they send them because it's very supportive. It helps set them up for after
Yeah.
treatment. And
I just
again,
want to argue
so
for a
here's the
second.
thing.
works.
I just want to
I-
respond because I think, Dan, you kind of elided my question. My question was around dominance as a problem, and you pointed out, but you got to some idea that there is more. It sounds like, by the way, actually, let me pause for a minute. You guys have a common enemy, maybe, which is the recovery and treatment centers.
the
Is
treatment
that,
industry
that
complex.
would be a whole different. That would be a whole different debate.
Okay,
That would be
got
a
it.
whole
It's
That's
for our
another
next-
debate,
that's
and we
for a
probably
future
would be on the
episode.
same side.
and you guys would have to be a co-team on that one. Yes.
I just want to point out really, really quickly. So it's it's interesting because I agree with you, Dan, that there has been a shift to reverting to more options. And I think part of the reason, if I can go back to why we're having this debate, is because too many people were so resistant to go into AA, the treatment center had to offer other options. And so again,
Mhm.
it is just showing that AA at least is not as it was only dominant because of the offerings. And now that there are other offerings, there are other things being offered. And I think what we'll see over time is a substantial moderation in this push to pretend that AA could work for everybody. And again, I'm not saying AA, the organization, does that. But as you pointed out in your opening statement, Dan, which AA are we talking about? The meetings, the people, the readings, the board.
One point I really want to get to is this point Dan made earlier about community, and you're getting to it too, these structures, these meetings, everything. I think that is and certainly I'm sure some of the alternatives that are being offered, Dharma, et cetera, that you're talking about might have a communal element. Is that true, Adi? They do?
Yeah, absolutely.
They do? Okay.
Yeah,
But-
very similar to 12-step meetings.
Yeah. I think that's this kind of, especially lonelier groups. Dan, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about men in particular, and there's all kinds of data in the world shows that men are more likely to commit suicide. Men have fewer friendships. And those are increasing challenges, particularly in this country, in the United States. But how do you think, Adi, how do you look at the communal aspect of Alcoholics Anonymous, of AA? Do you think that part is helpful? Or do you think that part also is dangerous?
Look, I said at the outset that I think if AA did some retooling, I would be a much bigger supporter of it. One of the big initial things is AA. They emerged from the Oxford group, so a very religious initial organization. I think if they soften this whole massive dependence on specifically Christian religion, right? Because everybody would always tell me, well, it's not about religion specifically; it's about any religion. I'm like, I'm Jewish. I literally never heard a Jewish prayer in a single AA meeting. They're all Christian prayers. So if we reduce that to some extent, that would be a huge initial point. And then I
Agreed.
absolutely agree on 2 points. The fellowship is probably the thing that AA got the most right in the first place. And I said this in my opening statement, you go back 90 to 100 years, the level of stigma around alcohol use issues was much, much greater than it is now. And AA provided a refuge for people in those rooms. We just come a long way since. And so I absolutely agree that having supportive environments is great. I'll just go back to what I said before. Not in all meetings and not by not by decree, but I've been in rooms over and over and over where people who actually have the biggest problems and may need that support the most get shunned because they're having the biggest obstacles meeting the long-term abstinence, which is a defined goal.
Dan, I'm going to give you literally 30 seconds to respond to that. Why is it better for those people to be in the room regardless, or for that room to exist in spite of the challenge that Adi is speaking about?
Well, it's like I said, I mean, literally just yesterday on NPR, there was a radio show about the epidemic of loneliness that is plaguing our country. Loneliness and disconnection. Like anything we can do to help heal that and put it in a place where people can be open and honest and kind of share what's really going in their lives, because we live in still such a phony, artificial world of people not really being truthful. Like, who doesn't really want that if you can have it in a safe and loving way?
We're having a very lively debate here. We found a few areas where you guys agree. Most importantly, that AA is not a monolith, that people who are struggling with challenges with alcohol are not a monolith themselves, and that you both have a shared enemy in the recovery treatment industrial complex. But
Enemy's
but
a bit strong.
There's a lot that you also disagree on. And we're going to bring in some other voices right now, members of the audience, journalists, to help probe at that. First, I'd like to welcome in David Ovalle. David is a health and science reporter at the Washington Post who covers opioids and addiction. David, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my main question is what do you guys think about the role of the criminal courts and AA? Should they be more disentangled? Is it an appropriate level of intermeshing where so many people that go to drug courts or get DUIs end up having to go to AA? I'd love to get your guys' takes on that role, and should it be is it appropriate the way it is now?
Well, I mean, I'll just jump in because I worked in drug courts for 10 years in Minnesota, and it was a phenomenal experience for me. I think it's one of the greatest advancements of therapeutic justice that we've had. We call it therapeutic jurisprudence. I think that combined element of basically public health and criminal justice is necessary as far as we know for the structures of addiction and dealing with addiction effectively. Because, some people are like, well, you criminalize addiction, you're going to criminalize diabetes and heart disease because they're similar diseases. It's like, yeah, but people don't drive the wrong way down the highway, when they're having too many donuts. And so it's like that balance that drug courts have established is absolutely wonderful. It does seem like with this new administration coming in, we're bound to go backwards, and we're not going to necessarily be, focusing. In drug courts, what we would talk about is we want to treat the ones that are not well, and we want to put in prison the ones, that are causing crimes. And so you need to distinguish between those and try to help in different ways. I think criminal justice infrastructure has its role in this. It's all in how it's done. In the way that drug courts have evolved and continue to evolve with therapeutic jurisprudence in the different topics, I think it's the right direction. I think it's what we want. And I think they're very effective.
Thank you, Dan. Adi, I want to give you a moment to respond to this question from David about the criminal courts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've only visited drug courts, although now we do a lot of work with Ignited in drug courts in Wisconsin and King County. But I've been to jail, and the statistics are that 85% of people who are criminal justice involved either struggle with drugs or are in for a drug-related offense. So there's no question that it's essentially, they're married problems, right? They're one and the same in a way. I will say this, in the same vein of the discussion we've been having, I think drug court used to be far, far too punitive and has come a long way. I just spoke at the All Rise conference last year, and we'll probably do the same thing again this year. Harm reduction is starting to make its way into criminal drug courts. And I think there's a reason for that. The stick-only approach doesn't work for people who struggle with a compulsive habit. It just doesn't fix things. So to answer the question really, really directly, it's this. I think we have to become more trauma informed. We have to become more mental health forward in our criminal justice engagement. There's no question that there are some people whose criminogenic factor involvement is just so high that they may just not be ready to get mental health and support. I, for sure, always err on the side of giving them too much mental health and support before we kick them to the curb, if you will. I'm a big, big supporter of as many carrots as we can offer in the process.
Thanks, Eddie. And thanks, David, for your question. Next, I'd like to bring in Sally Satel. Sally is a psychiatrist, a lecturer at Yale University School of Medicine, and a visiting professor at Columbia University. Sally, welcome, and we'd love to hear your question.
Thanks. This question is for Eddie. So I know you see patients. What would you do with a patient who came to you just beginning to, get help, has been addicted or to drugs or alcohol for years, and says that, in addition to coming to see you in a more formal way, that he also started an AA meeting. And, it piqued his curiosity, and he found a good one because, as you know, there's so much variability between these. You could find a fit in some place and not others. Anyway, what would you say to him? Because he is already, sort of positively predisposed to this engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the question, and I don't have to make this a a pretend role play. I've dealt with this many a time.
I'm sure.
I'm a big supporter of every person finding the specific approach that works for them. So my recommendation would be to continue engaging in whatever is working in the moment. I will actually even tell you that I've supported and helped people who are in AA but dissatisfied. And my first recommendation is not, well, leave the meetings and never go to another one, right? It's to implore and ask, what is it that is working and what is not? Because to the point that we were making earlier, I need to understand the underlying reasons, the motivations, the mental health factors that are driving the behavior in the first place. Structure and a sponsor may actually be the right thing for a subset of people.
So it sounds a little bit like everything you've said before, and I've agreed with much of it. It's almost more in a kind of a policy kind of domain than in an actual clinical, because like most good clinicians, I work in a methadone clinic, everyone's an individual, everyone's history is different, and everyone's needs are different. And it seems you endorse it as well.
Yeah, I'll answer that really quickly, right? In the debate, you get a yes and a no side, right?
Yeah.
There's no yes but or no but, and so there's no question. I'm not a big believer in black and white solutions. Period. I am encouraged by the direction things are moving in. I'll just say it that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, for your question and for sharing your experience as well as a psychiatrist. Next up, we have Jamie Marich. Jamie is a speaker, a clinical trauma specialist, an expressive artist, and author of Trauma and the 12 Steps, a complete guide to enhancing recovery. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you. So I have a lot of big feelings coming up. Mostly my thoughts towards Dr. Jaffe are, I'm wondering if you have looked into those of us who have updated language, even if it's not part of the organization Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think that was just the comment I had at first, because there are a lot of us who work in professional treatment who have been doing that. There are organizations like ICSA, the International Society for Secular AA, people who resist the God language. There are Jewish AA conferences and fellowships. Almost anything can be found online. But this is really for both of you, whoever wants to answer it. One of the reasons I didn't debate this is because I'm right in the middle of where both of you stand. I describe myself as AA's biggest critic, but I defend it because I would not be alive without it. And I think if people have experiences that are positive with AA, it's kind of similar to this thing of, does AA work? How are you defining AA? Like, what about Christianity in modern America? How are you defining Christianity? Because there's a lot of us who are like, Jesus never said that, but we know that founders and organizers within Christianity can, blow it out of proportion. I think my biggest question, though, is there a shaming that happens? Because, Dr. Jaffe talked a lot about the shaming language that can and does happen in AA. I'm the first to admit that. But I also feel a lot of shame from the other side, like, oh, you're so backward for still promoting AA. Does that happen, whether it's a person benefiting from AA, the meetings or the treatment approaches, or those of us who still say, hey, it's an option?
Thank you very much, Jamie, for sharing that question, for sharing where you stand on the issue and the kind of the thoughts and challenges that come up for you as we debate this topic. Maybe, Dan, I'll start with you because, how do you take Jamie's question? What do you think about the shame?
I have a lot of respect for Jamie. I've known her and them a long time. And, the work, that Jamie has done for years is pushing us to look at really difficult things that we don't necessarily want to look at. And so I appreciate that. I mean, look, is there shaming in AA meetings? You bet. Is there shaming outside of AA meetings? You bet. Absolutely. I mean, look, to Adi's point, a lot of treatment programs have gone to the other extreme where it's like there's no option for 12 steps, even when people want them, because they're not 12-step either friendly or they have like their own ideas about it. So I think we're in a disruptive period, quite frankly. And I think it's a positive because I think it's a result of the evolution. I think it's this groundswell in the grassroots of recovery and 12-step recovery culture that's basically saying like, we can do better, or some of this stuff, it doesn't, and then there's the folks like Adi who see that and leave. And then there are the folks like others who see that and they stay. And one's not right or wrong, but the truth is, I think we're at a point where the more we can have conversations like this and really talk, about it and understand what's happening, I think the more we can really kind of grasp the fact that nobody should be shaming anybody for just trying to get well.
I really want to be able to touch on this for at least a moment or two. First of all, thank you for what you just said, Jamie. And for me, AA couldn't have worked long term because I decided to take the AA experiment, if you will, about 22 years ago, and so I would not have been welcome in the rooms. They would have not accepted my version of recovery, right? I know that for a fact. I'm not sober, and so I just want to call that out. So there are some versions of recovery that are just not acceptable in the rooms. Jamie, to your point, I think it misservices and represents what recovery should mean when we shame anybody for any approach that they took on. Number one, the goal is to help people get better. Now, it is wonderful and beautiful and incredible that there are specific practitioners who are AA aligned and also, like you, push forward the research and the work on aligning with additional therapies. My question is just this: essentially, instead of all being these sort of little branches that branch off and have no support from the general organization, when is the system itself going to adjust? And that's, then we're not fighting the tree. It's like we are all part of the same thing. Like I said before, I have coaches on my program that are in AA currently. They are 12-step members right now. I do not shame anybody who's in any recovery that works for them.
I get the impression, though, Adi, that you weren't aware that there's a plain language big book.
I didn't know about the plain language one.
And that's huge.
Yeah, I think there was I think this was a very interesting conversation. Thank you, Jamie, again for this question. I think there was a kind of critique in there of Adi, like is there some monolithization of AA in this conversation or some outdatedness of your understanding of it? I'm just curious how you respond to that.
Here's the thing, right? And so imagine any other treatment approach. I mean, literally take any other, we'll talk about medical treatment just here for a second, but imagine if the application of a specific medication differed by the bottle, by the physician, by the county, by the state, by the pharmacy you fill it up in. We would have serious issues with that approach, right? Like, hey, let's just take naltrexone. It's a medication for alcohol use disorder. Imagine if you got different medication from different places for naltrexone, like the chemical in the pill would be different. That would be an issue. And so it's hard for me, the question of does AA work? We have to have some sort of a standard. And the question, does AA work, asks us to consider AA as a whole.
But you got to remember, AA does not present itself as treatment or a treatment. And that's a very, very important distinction.
Thank you guys for this conversation. And thank you, Jamie, for joining us. We have one more questioner. Next up is Maia Szalavitz. Maia is a reporter who focuses on science, on public policy, and addiction treatment. She's the author of Undoing Drugs, How Harm Reduction is Changing the Future of Drugs and Addiction. Maia, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. What I would like to ask is about the connection between AA and the treatment field, because I've asked online, can you find me 10 rehabs in which the content is not primarily 12-step? Like when you go to treatment, what happens most of the time in your treatment hours is being indoctrinated into 12 steps are the best way. There have been some changes, but for the most part, people are still being told that, for example, if you are on methadone or buprenorphine, you are not clean, even though the data shows that these medications reduce the death rate from opioid use disorder by 50% or more. And yet, if I want to help somebody find treatment, I get people sent to what is the equivalent of insurer and taxpayer paid 12-step meetings as sold as treatment. And to me, the question isn't, does AA work or not? It's why are we as taxpayers and people who pay into insurance paying people to provide treatment that you can get for free in a church basement and that does not work for everybody?
All right. Thank you. That's a really interesting question about your common, not quite enemy, the recovery industrial complex, and also and its reliance on AA, this infrastructure that's been set up over decades on a fee basis. I don't know who would like to respond to that.
I'll jump in. I mean,
yeah, Dan, go ahead.
We both have thoughts
Yeah.
on this. And Maia, thanks for your question. I've followed your work for a long time. I'm going to get in trouble with my friends. Look, I mean, the truth is, I love both and, right? I don't like the either or stuff.
Oh, get in trouble, Dan. It's okay. You
Okay,
can say what you were going to
truth,
say.
well, the truth is, I could easily, quickly find you the names of 10 programs that don't do any 12-step connection whatsoever. There's many out there, but they are for sure not the dominant model. The other thing is that, again, distinguishing from AA, very different. The majority of 12-step focused treatment programs now have, they are trauma informed. They have mental health interventions. They have EMDR or brain spotting. They have comprehensive care. They use CBT. They use DBT. They use all these different modalities.
In
they
my
are
experience,
far
they say
from
that they use those things, and then when the patients actually talk to me after going to those places, what they have gotten is don't drink and go to meetings.
That's not my experience in the last 10 years of visiting numerous programs and working with them and seeing what they were doing, to the point, Maia, where I was sometimes like, it doesn't even seem like you're doing anything to actually teach them about the 12 steps, even though you say you're connected to it, other than just sending them to meetings and not talking about it.
It's a really interesting conversation because it's like one of you thinks the 12 steps is a boon, and another one thinks it's being used lightly. But I think that Adi, I'm curious how you respond to this idea, this commercialization of AA, and packaged and sold as an alternative to AA, potentially at cost.
It's probably not a big surprise that I'm relatively aligned with Maia on this, but
yeah, because
but
does it go to your dominance argument around AA?
It does, and I will say this. 10, 15 years ago, 10 would have been a hard number to pick, right? There was like Practical Recovery, Aton. There would have been a handful. Sorry for advertising some treatment centers. I'm not aligned with any of those. The number has grown. Many of them are smaller and boutique. The big standard kind of Goliaths in our industry are still primarily traditional. And to speak to Dan's point, many of them do purport to offer a whole slew of adjunct therapies. But then to support part of Maia's, having talked to patients who've been in them, I'll say the majority of the actual therapeutic support that they get is 12-step aligned. Now, again, we only get to pick a black and a white side in a debate because that's just what ends up happening here. I do want to say this, Maia. I think we're moving in the right direction. By the way, you're one of the reasons why that's happened, right? Stanton Peele, who's not here right now, is a staunch, hardcore anti-AA representative, and I think we also need voices all the way on that extreme to push for people to open facilities that are not there. There's no question the dominance is still 12-step.
Thank you, Adi, and thank you, Maia, for that question. This has been a really fascinating conversation, so thank you both for taking black and white positions in an area where it seems like neither of you really quite want to. But it's time to bring it home with closing remarks. So, Dan, you have the first opportunity for a closing remark. Give us one last reason why you believe AA does work.
All right. So, does AA work? Yes, of course it does. Is it perfect? Of course it's not. Is it the best intervention for alcoholism? Maybe. Is it the only one? Of course not. There's a joke in AA. The newcomer asks in a meeting, "How does it work?" And the old timer, in a quiet voice, responds, "Just fine, thank you." Will AA evolve to meet the needs of its members and our changing culture? I have every confidence it will, to the slightest degree necessary, because AA protects itself just as much as possible against the vagaries of change. What organization is a more closed system? A multi-million member worldwide organization that will accept anyone in its doors with open arms and that's free, versus a primary relationship with one therapist or two and an individual that you have to pay. So what does it mean for AA to work? Is it true that 3 to 5% of those who attend AA stay and get sober? Possibly. How do you measure the impact of a chronic alcoholic on our society? Medical emergencies, job productivity, criminal activity, violence, impact on children and other family members, to name only some. And what is the impact on our society when all of those things go away for just one person? Not to mention all of the pluses that occur as a result of their sobriety. Families restored, loving relationships with kids, productivity, giving back to the community. As we've talked about, AA estimates about 2 million people in 180 countries worldwide. So take that one person that I just described and multiply it by 2 million plus people, and then tell me what is the impact. And then ask me again if AA really works.
Thank you, Dan, for that closing argument. And now, Adi, you'll have the final word here in this debate. Convince us again why AA does not work.
Thank you. So it's been pointed out numerous times, certainly if you were asking whether AA is an effective treatment or if it works as a treatment for addiction, the answer is no by its own definition, right? And so I would say that one of the main reasons we should say AA does not work is when you look at all the people who enter AA, the vast majority of them are not helped by it. We've also identified that there's at least a good amount of evidence that says that people can actually be harmed by it. And, last but not least, the idea that AA itself doesn't really mean all that much because it's being applied in so many different ways. What people need when they struggle with something like addiction is certainty. They need reliability. And as it stands right now, AA doesn't offer that. Add to this the fact that we use outdated terms like alcoholic and addict. People like myself, by the way, I was addicted to meth, as I mentioned earlier on. When I walked into a rehab, they didn't send people to, Meth Addicts Anonymous, because there's now anonymous meetings for everything. So they sent me to Alcoholic Anonymous meetings. And I was told over and over and over that it doesn't matter that my addiction was one thing. I have to identify as an alcoholic every single day. I literally looked at people and said, but I don't drink. They couldn't care less. They're dogmatic. They have an idea of my way or the highway. And it says it literally in one of the main readings in AA called How It Works, which Dan just alluded to, by the way. Rarely have we seen a person fail. I don't know about a much more delusional language to say that rarely have we seen a person fail when 70% of people who try you out can't even make it 3 months. We have evidence that the language is outdated. We've been told here before that much of it needs to change and get updated. It is great to hear that that is starting, but starting is not in existence. What we need to do at best for AA to be considered working is a pretty major overhaul, removing the massive dogma around religion, potentially also around abstinence, and reducing much of the dependence on this incredibly outdated 100-year-old language. So, like many other therapeutic approaches in the past, it's time to catch up.
Thank you so much, Adi, for that closing argument. That concludes our debate. I'd really like to thank our debaters, Dan Griffin and Adi Jaffe. We so appreciate you showing up. You're approaching this debate with an open mind, and you're bringing your thoughtful disagreement to the table. In short, you're being open to debate. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank my fellow journalists and the other interrogators and experts for bringing their questions to the table. Thank you, David, Sally, Jamie, and Maia. And finally, a big thank you to you, the audience, for tuning in to this episode of Open to Debate. I realize that this topic can hit home for many people listening, and hope that this program offered something helpful to anyone who is or knows somebody who is facing challenges with alcohol or other addiction. Thank you for listening to Open to Debate. As a nonprofit working to combat extreme polarization through civil debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you, the Rosencrantz Foundation, and supporters of Open to Debate. Robert Rosencrantz is our chairman, our CEO is Clea Connor, Leah Mathau is our Chief Content Officer, and Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our Chief Advancement Officer. This episode was produced by Jessica Glazer and Marlette Sandoval, editorial and research by Gabriella Mayer and Tom Bunting. Andrew Lipson and Max Fulton provided production support. And the Open to Debate team also includes Gabrielle Iannicelli, Annalisa Cochran, Rachel Kemp, Eric Gross, Mary Regas, and Linda Lee. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode, and our theme music is by Alex Clement. And I'm your host, Naima Raza. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.